following World Watch program is a delayed telecast from the Public Broadcasting Service of the United States of America. SBS wishes to advise it does not endorse the content.
Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff. Jim Lehrer is away. On the NewsHour tonight, the news of this Friday, then the latest on the deadly attacks and counterattacks in Iraq. A NewsHour report on Republican moderates swept out of office on Election Day. Weekly analysis from David Brooks and E.J. Dion substituting for Mark Shields. And two takes on the crisis in Darfur, another in our series of conversations about what the world can do. And Darfur photographs on exhibit at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer is provided by...
At CIT, we provide the financing to keep healthcare strong and healthy. We help energy companies find new resources. We work with communications companies to make the world smaller and life bigger. We offer financial aid to make college possible for more students. At CIT, we help finance the future because that's the place to be. See it with CIT.
Somewhere in the heartland, a child is sitting down to breakfast, which is why a farmer is rising for a 15-hour day, and a trucker is beginning a 5-day journey. An ADM is turning corn and wheat, soy and cocoa beans into your favorite foods. Somewhere in the heartland, a child is sitting down to breakfast, which is why so many work so long and take their job to heart. ADM, resourceful by nature.
And by Pacific Life, Toyota, BP, the Atlantic Philanthropies, the National Science Foundation, and with the continuing support of these institutions and foundations, and...
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Reprisal killings swept across Baghdad today after yesterday's mass attacks on Shiites. 6 Sunni men were burned alive by Shiite militia after leaving their mosque. At least 19 more died in attacks at 7 other Sunni mosques. And there were reports that a U.S. helicopter returned fire on Shiite militia in Sadr City. Funeral processions were held across the capital in spite of an indefinite curfew. The death toll in yesterday's chain of timed explosions rose to 215. There was also violence farther north in Tal Afar, where 23 Iraqis died in a suicide bombing. Followers of Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr threatened to pull out of the Iraqi parliament today. They want Iraqi Prime Minister al-Maliki to cancel a planned meeting with President Bush. They are scheduled to meet next Wednesday in Jordan. Al-Sadr's block of seats in Parliament forms the backbone of Maliki's political support. We'll have more on Iraq right after the news summary. A former KGB spy blamed Russian President Putin for his poisoning before he died. Alexander Litvinenko died yesterday in a London hospital. Today, an investigation was underway. We have a report from Lucy Manning of Independent Television News.
Friends and relatives leaving the hospital today believe the Kremlin is definitely to blame. Mr. Litvinenko sent a message to the Russian president from his deathbed, read out by his friend.
But as I lie here, I can distinctly hear the beatings of wings of the angel of death. I may be able to give him the slip, but I have to say my legs do not run as fast as I would like. You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life.
In the middle of central London, Itsu Sushi Bar closed to the public today, where Litvinenko ate before falling ill. Police investigating his death have found traces of radiation at the restaurant. It's not known what levels. The Millennium Hotel, where it's thought he met a former KGB officer on the same day. Traces of radiation have also been found here and at his home. It seems as if Mr. Litvinenko left a trail of radiation behind him. The Home Secretary revealed today that Mr. Litvinenko's condition leading to his death last night is believed to be linked to the presence of a radioactive substance in his body. At 6 o'clock last night, the Health Protection Agency was told large quantities of alpha radiation from a substance called polonium-210 had been found in Mr. Litvinenko's urine. The two hospitals where he was treated, University College Hospital and Barnet General, are also being monitored for levels of radiation. No one yet knows how many working there may possibly be at risk, and no one yet knows how the polonium-210 got into Mr. Litvinenko's body.
At a summit in Finland today, Russian President Putin denied any involvement, and he said there was no proof that Litvinenko had died a violent death. The Russian government did pledge to cooperate in the British investigation. A bomb threat at Northern Ireland's Parliament building today delayed plans for a power-sharing government. An infamous Protestant militant, Michael Stone, tossed a bag filled with 6 bombs into the building. Police tackled and arrested him outside and later safely defused the bombs. In London, British Prime Minister Blair urged Protestant and Irish Catholic politicians to keep working toward a coalition.
Instead of that putting us off progress towards democracy, is precisely what should make us more resolute in consigning that type of activity to the past and making sure that democratically elected politicians are able to exercise their democratically given power without paramilitaries of any sort interfering with it.
Stone was paroled from prison in 2000 as part of a negotiated peace deal. He had been serving time for killing 3 people at an Irish Republican Army funeral in 1998. In the U.S., shoppers swarmed malls and discount stores today for so-called Black Friday. Customers were in line in some places before midnight. Retailers lured them with deep discounts and expanded opening hours. Black Friday was once considered the busiest shopping day of the year. Now that honor falls to the last Saturday before Christmas. On Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost more than 46 points to close at 12,280. The NASDAQ fell more than 5 points to close at 2460. For the week, the Dow lost 0.5%. The NASDAQ rose 0.6%. That's it for the news summary tonight. Now, the spiraling chaos in Iraq. Moderate Republicans out of office. Brooks and Dion. Plus a conversation and a photo exhibit about Darfur. Jeffrey Brown has the Iraq story.
It was the single deadliest attack by Iraqis on other Iraqis since the U.S. invasion in 2003. Yesterday, suspected Sunni militants staged a well-coordinated string of bombings across the Shiite stronghold of Sadr City in Baghdad. At least 5 car bombs detonated in crowded marketplaces and busy intersections 15 minutes apart. More than 200 Iraqis were killed, hundreds more wounded. The reprisals quickly followed as Shiites lashed out, attacking the most popular Sunni mosque in Baghdad with mortar rounds. Iraq's top leaders met last night and issued a televised appeal for calm.
I hope that all political and popular forces will come together to protect the people and all people from the violence of the criminals. I also ask the security forces to guard the people, to prevent the deterioration of the situation and stop this sectarian unrest.
Today, the bereaved buried their dead, while across Baghdad the counterattacks mounted, leaving dozens more dead, despite a curfew imposed by the national government. Radical Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr today blamed U.S. forces for not securing the city. His political loyalists in the parliament threatened to leave the coalition government if Iraq's prime minister goes ahead with a planned meeting with President Bush next week in Jordan. There were also reports today of U.S. forces exchanging fire with Iraqis in Sadr City. One officer said this of the difficulty of the U.S. task.
If you're helping the Sunni then the Shia think you're out to kill Shias.
The latest violence follows a UN report this week that Iraq has suffered the highest monthly total of civilian casualties since 2003. More than 3,700 Iraqis were killed in October, 400 more than the month before. Now some analysis of these particularly turbulent past 2 days. For that, we're joined by Salameh Nemat, Washington bureau chief for the Arab daily newspaper Al Hayat, and for LBC, a Lebanese Arab satellite channel. He's a Jordanian citizen. And Mark Levine, a professor of Middle East history at the University of California at Irvine. And welcome to both of you. Professor Levine, starting with you, with this new escalation of violence, how would you define the point where we've reached in Iraq?
Well, I think Iraq really represents the first globalized civil war. You know, previously you could have countries that would have a strong state and a weak society like Iraq under Saddam, or a weak state but a strong cohesive national identity. Today you have a weak, ineffectual state and a society that has literally been shattered, and there's very little unity left. And that's what's making Iraq so difficult to put back together, so difficult to bring the parties together, and what's making any kind of comparison we can draw between Iraq and, let's say, Vietnam, you know, facile and quite inaccurate.
Mr. Nemat, how do you see what's going on? Who's driving it now and with what motivations?
To begin with, I don't agree that these hatreds of, within and the splits within the Iraqi society just took place after the Iraq war, the 2003 war. I think that for the past several decades, the former regime of Saddam Hussein has basically been responsible mainly for these divisions within society. 300,000 people were found in mass graves after the fall of his regime. And what happened is that by removing Saddam Hussein, the U.S. removed the lid over all these problems. There used to be the centralized, very, very oppressive regime that kept things under wraps, such as when Tito was ruling Yugoslavia. When Tito died, Yugoslavia was splintered. Yugoslavia became former Yugoslavia, and there you've got the Bosnians and the Serbs and the different groups basically fighting each other until finally there was another war to finish the job, the War of Kosovo, which was led by the U.S. under Clinton. So I think what we have in Iraq now is something that was inevitable. Whether the U.S. intervened or not, we were going to have this once the strong man of Iraq is down, which used to be Saddam Hussein. The question is, where do we go from here? And I think this is the more important question at this stage.
Well, Professor Levine, follow up on that. First of all, how coordinated is the violence at this point?
Well, I don't think it's coordinated on a national level. In fact, you have, even within the various sectarian divisions, in the north near the Syrian border, you have Ba'athist Sunnis fighting Salafi Sunnis. You have the Mahdi's army disobeying, a direct order from the Shia government. You have Skiri and Dawa, fighting each other. This is clearly a level of conflict that is devolving to much more fundamental level, and there is no political structure to help put this back together. In this kind of situation, it's hard to know whom to speak with, especially if the U.S. is seen by everyone as being the generator and in many ways the beneficiary of this kind of chaos. And somehow there needs to be an intermediary who all sides can think of as not having a vested interest in either the status quo or any specific outcome, who could come in and begin the very long and painful process of healing.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Nemat? This division of power, this lack of a sole power source that one would even talk to?
There's no doubt about it. You need a central kind of powerful central government to begin with. This doesn't exist today, but there is no other alternative but to continue on this level to try to strengthen the central government. I think that what we have in Iraq today is a sort of a global war, regional and a global war, with the U.S. Moderate governments on the one side trying to help the democratically elected government of Maliki, and we've got the Syrians and the Iranians and the other countries that do not wish to see democracy in their midst because they fear that democracy might spread and might undermine their regimes. So this is a global war in a sense. Unfortunately, it looks like the U.S. and Western alliance, if you like, with the moderates are losing simply because they're losing the political battle. On the ground, I think this is not the case. In 2004, the insurgents were able to claim that they were in control of cities like Fallujah. Today, they cannot claim control over any area of Iraq. And in that sense, I think the Iraqi army is fighting, and they are making progress. The problem is that there is no stomach in Washington to continue supporting this war. So it's a case of losing politically while you are winning militarily, in my view.
Well, let me ask first you, Professor Levine, about one of the key figures we mentioned in the setup, Muqtada al-Sadr, talking about leaving the government. At least some of his representatives were talking about that today. How much, to what extent is he actually in control of things now, and what would the impact be if he were to leave the government?
Well, I think his threat reflects the fact that he's losing control of the street and trying to get ahead of his own people who've been acting on their own. You know, he started off as kind of this gangster rapper figure who really had the ear of the street and was speaking to the concerns of these young, unemployed, angry, armed men. And then suddenly he's part of the government, he's part of the higher level political process, and he's not necessarily viewed as close to the street, so people act on their own. This is his attempt, most likely, to try to regain control of his base. But if the Mahdi's army is already disobeying the government and not following orders and acting on its own, then his leaving officially the government, while it might have some symbolic value, it's only going to reflect something that's already happening on the ground.
And Mr. Nemat, al-Sadr is also now demanding that Prime Minister Maliki not meet with President Bush next week. A White House spokesman today said that meeting would go on. Where does that leave Prime Minister Maliki?
I don't think that Muqtada al-Sadr can basically opt out of the government and parliament, because he might end up shooting himself in the foot, unless he guarantees that his withdrawal from the government is going to bring it down and is going to call for new elections, which doesn't look likely at this stage. I think he's just basically doing Iran's bid, in a sense. Iran wants to say Iran is backing the Muqtada al-Sadr militia and other militias in Iraq. And the Iranians do not want the Iraqis to go to Washington to solve their problems. They want the Iraqis to come to Tehran to solve their problems. It's a power struggle between America and Iran and their allies on either side, with the Iraqis caught in the middle, with the Iraqi government caught in the middle. And I think Muqtada al-Sadr is playing on these divisions and these polarizing forces.
Let me ask you about the U.S. role here. We saw that clip of the U.S. captain, I think it was, expressing the frustration. If they come up looking like they're on one side, they have this problem, the other side, they have another problem. Can the U.S. have a role in stemming the violence that we're seeing in the streets right now?
I'm afraid the U.S. cannot openly take sides in this conflict, but if it doesn't take sides, in a sense, at least with the government, the democratically elected government, if it doesn't side with the majority, and it appears to be appeasing or trying to appease the Sunni minority, is going to send the wrong signal and is going to lose both sides. It looks like to me that a shortcut would be the U.S. to decide its strategy. The Shiites are a majority. They have the right to form the government. Too bad for the Sunnis. They have to understand that they lost the war, that their man Saddam Hussein is in prison, waiting execution probably, and that this is the only way to, in a way, cut short this confrontation.
Professor Levine, how do you see it?
Well, I think we can't divorce this from history, not surprising since I'm a historian, but, you know, the U.S. went in talking the rhetoric of democracy, but I think most commentators and most scholars who knew Iraq and the region knew we never had any intention of really bringing democracy, because of the implications across the board in the region, which would have been against our interests. So because of this, from the very beginning, as anyone who was in Iraq like me saw, it was plagued by so much corruption, so much violence, so much countering against democratic forces on the ground that we helped create this situation. So the U.S. now is just viewed so negatively by everyone. I think there has to be another mediating force, perhaps the UN, since it's been sort of out of Iraq as a leading role long enough, or some Arab forces who aren't tainted, or other forces from around the world who can come in and create a kind of mediating, a kind of conference that could maybe begin to heal the wounds if everyone understands that the end process is one where the U.S. has gone from Iraq.
All right, Mark Levine, Salameh Nemat, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Still to come, Brooks and Dion, plus words and photographs about Darfur. Those follow a report on several Republican moderates who won't rejoin the new Congress in January. NewsHour congressional correspondent Kwame Holman has the story.
Among the many congressional Republicans swept from office on Election Day, one type of Republican was hit especially hard, the moderate, such as Iowa's Jim Leach.
Clearly this year the country wanted change.
Of the 29 House seats Republicans lost, 11 were in the Northeast and 10 more were in the Midwest. The party's losses were fewer in traditionally Republican territories. New Hampshire's Charles Bass.
The Republican Party is in danger of becoming a regional party of the South and the West.
Of the most prominent Republicans to lose their seats, several were among the House and Senate's best-known moderates. Ohio Senator Mike DeWine, who compromised with Democrats last year to prevent filibusters of judicial nominees. Congressman Leach of Iowa, one of the most liberal Republicans in the House. He voted against the Iraq War and long has favored abortion rights. Connecticut's Nancy Johnson, a pro-abortion rights and pro-environment stalwart whose views earned her 24 years in Washington. And Congressman Bass of New Hampshire. Last year, he rallied colleagues to join Democrats in blocking Republican efforts to permit oil exploration on Alaska's North Slope. Those 4 members, with a combined 78 years of experience in Congress, were rejected by voters. Here's what they think happened.
We had a real red tide in New Hampshire. It was a tidal wave, and in retrospect, with a straight ticket voting, which we have in the state as well, it probably was impossible for me to win.
There was just the antipathy to the president, to some of the things the right wing of my party has espoused, to Iraq, and it added up for the first time in my 30 years in political life to actually the individual member and their record not mattering.
All I can say is that I'm comfortable with the positions I have taken, and I also respect the public for wanting to express change in the way the public has the right to do, which is at the ballot box.
I can't tell you how many people looked at me and said, you know, Mike, I really like you. You're a good guy. You've done a really good job as a United States Senator, but I'm not voting for you.
The Republicans all agreed that widespread opposition to the Iraq War, coupled with the unpopularity of President Bush, played large roles in their ouster. But there were differences about other factors that brought them down. New Hampshire's Charles Bass said his party's carefree style of governing caught up with it.
Quite frankly, I told the Speaker this over a year ago, that I thought that the Republicans had become like the Democrats were in 1994. There was an element of sort of laissez-faire easiness about our leadership, that somehow we were insulated enough from mainstream America so that we could get away with having an indicted individual as acting majority leader, that the agenda really was only about the Republican base, and it wasn't about the great middle America where most of the voters are. And when the Speaker failed to respond forcefully and quickly to the Mark Foley affair, I think that was basically the end of our majority.
Connecticut's Nancy Johnson argued that in her case, negative ads and other campaign tactics distorted voters' perceptions, preventing her party's legitimate accomplishments from being heard.
Pensions aren't finished, but we made great leaps forward. Medicare isn't finished, but it's going to provide us with a model that will help us across the board with every age group. And we started fixing that in the Deficit Reduction Act so that Medicaid can concentrate on chronic illness as well. It's very exciting and very positive, but it isn't stuff that the citizens understand yet. And that's why record really wasn't it, just anguish, anger, and worry about Iraq.
Ohio's Mike DeWine said his downfall was due to corruption within the state's GOP, where both the Republican governor and a popular congressman were indicted earlier this year.
In Ohio, it was a particular problem because we had the state scandals, which I had nothing to do with, but it created this horrible, horrible climate in Ohio. So Ohio was the perfect storm. Ohio was the national trend. Ohio was the state trend. I may be wrong, but I like to think that I could have survived one of them, but not two of them.
Whatever the reasons they lost, DeWine and the others say the reality now is there will be fewer moderate Republicans willing to compromise with the incoming Democratic majority in Congress. They say as a result, the ideological divisions that have contributed to years of partisanship and gridlock may grow wider.
The great weakness in the American legislative process is the middle has virtually collapsed. And how to reconstruct a principled center, a center of gravity in American politics, may be the hardest single thing at this particular time.
New Hampshire's Bass said the Republican Party is at risk of permanently losing its moderate middle if its agenda continues to cater to religious and social conservatives.
If they want it to be that way, it will be that way. If they want to develop and explore and debate issues that are attractive to Northeastern and Midwestern candidates, it'll be a very different situation. And it's really up to them, because if it's just us versus them and the Democrats succeed in moderating their agenda a little bit, it'll be very hard for Republicans to win in New England. Very hard.
Meanwhile, as is typical following an election, members of both parties pledged to work together in the new Congress despite their recent partisan history.
I hope that the talk of bipartisanship turns out to be true. It is really what the American people want. It's what the American people are yearning for, actually demanding. And I think if people don't understand that, they've missed what the American people really want.
You know, when I came, it was just assumed. I mean, once the election was over, you did your work here. And those who thought the same about something worked together. We need to get back to that, and we will get back to that, because in the end, it's good policy that makes good politics.
Congressman Jim Leach, heading back to Iowa City after 30 years of service in Washington, was less optimistic.
I have to say I'm disappointed with the general direction and tone of American politics and that is set in Congress. The comedy levels, the fact that people seem to be increasingly making decisions on what outcome is best for a political party or for an individual rather than what the national interest is. And that has nothing to do with what's best for the country. And that is something legislatures have to return to.
As their staffs clear the way for new inhabitants, these outgoing Republican moderates end long careers in Congress, hoping the party will heed their advice.
And now the analysis of Brooks and Dion. New York Times columnist David Brooks and Washington Post columnist E.J. Dion. Mark Shields is off tonight. David, to you first. This new terrible spike in violence in Iraq, or I should say another, is this a new phase, or is this just more of the same? How do you read it?
Well, I think the big implication, first of all, is that events in Iraq are happening faster than events in Washington. And what we're seeing is the disintegration of Iraqi society. I think about 10,000 Iraqis move every week back to their tribal homelands, Shia to Shia areas, Sunni to Sunni areas. And so you've had almost 500,000 people move. And so what's happening is the society as an organism is pulling back into itself. And I suspect that American policy and world policy hasn't really caught up with that yet.
You see it that way?
Well, you know, I mean, the administration wanted to wage this war in the worst way, and in the other sense, tragically, it did. I mean, from the very beginning, we were not able to establish order in Iraq, which was the thing that Iraqis expected us to do. And we let these problems fester and fester, and I think the administration didn't realize that there was a time limit on this, that the American people weren't willing to stay here forever. They didn't have all the time in the world, and that the forces on the ground, as was mentioned in the earlier segment, were going to begin to fly apart if we didn't really establish order and some trust in our ability to provide order so the Iraqi government could have confidence. I think the problem now is that it's not clear how you put this back together. Once the China is broken, it's broken. And there are a lot of regional forces with both an interest, on the one hand, in avoiding civil war, and that's what we've got to count on, that we can get some of those regional forces together to say, if this gets out of hand, we're in trouble. On the other hand, Iran does have an interest in its influence in the South, and I think Iran profits from the fact that we are in the middle of this mess. And Syria, whose help we need, is also a real problem for us, not only in Iraq, but also in Lebanon. So this is a very, very difficult situation to solve.
Well, speaking of those regional forces, David, tomorrow was supposed to be a meeting that the Iranian leader had called of the Syrians and the Iraqis. That meeting may be in doubt, but there do seem to be some effort. The president's going to be there meeting with the Iraqi leader in Lebanon next week. Could there be a regional answer somehow?
I hope so, but I guess I'm a little dubious. In the first place, as somebody mentioned earlier in the program, Muqtada al-Sadr is having trouble keeping up with reality on the streets. I really have trouble thinking that people in Tehran or Amman or Damascus are going to be any better at keeping up with what's actually happening on the streets than Muqtada al-Sadr is sitting right there. And then the second thing to fear is the way this will ripple out throughout the Middle East. The Sunni-Shia warfare that's going on right now is not going to be unwatched in Saudi Arabia, in Lebanon, and other places where there's either Shia or Sunni and Shia populations with presumably higher and higher levels of hostility. And I have to say, the one approach that seems to make some sense to me right now is an approach that's long been championed by a guy named Peter Galbraith and has more recently been championed by Joe Biden and Les Gelb. And that's acknowledging the reality on the ground and not trying to partition the country, but acknowledging that people are moving back to their areas and trying to set up some local authorities within sectarian groups.
So are you saying the regional efforts are really just a sideshow here and the focus needs to be inside Iraq?
I really have trouble believing people outside Iraq are going to be able to do a better job than we have or anybody else has in imposing order in Iraq. And by the way, I'm not totally convinced that Iran's interests dovetail with ours to any great extent, let alone Syria's interests. Syria has an interest, for example, in Lebanon in destabilizing the Lebanese government. We have an interest in propping up that government. Our interests just don't dovetail with regimes like Syria and Iran.
And EJ, you know, but isn't it what, I mean, aren't we hearing from different sources that this talking to the region may be what the Baker Hamilton Iraq Study Group is, among other things, that they're going to suggest?
When you have no really good options left, you go to options that may or may not work, but they're all that you can try. And I agree with David. I think that the regional powers have real conflict within themselves over what they want. He's right that our interests conflict with Syria's and with Iran's. On the other hand, as he said earlier, Syria and Iran, and certainly Saudi Arabia, and certainly Jordan, do not have an interest in this thing flying apart. I mean, it could be very, very dangerous to them. And so while this is not a great option, I do think that it is one option worth pursuing, trying to get some regional cooperation to ending this. I have some sympathy for the Galbraith-Biden idea in terms of quasi-partition, not quite partition. The problem is it doesn't seem to play in Iraq. A lot of the Iraqis on various sides say they don't really want to do this. There are other ideas floating around that maybe the American forces are going to have to pull back and let some of this conflict play itself out, because we don't want our forces sitting in the middle of a civil war, because that is a no-win situation for our own troops.
David, some people would look at what's going on and say there's no reason to wait another minute, that whether it's the solution you just described or another one, something needs to happen very, very fast. Do you agree with that, or do we have more time?
Well, I certainly understand EJ's point that why should we sit in the middle of a civil war? On the other hand, there does seem to be some acknowledgement among people of all stripes that we have had some effect on keeping the lid on this civil war, and if it spills out into civil war and really hundreds of thousands are killed, that's a moral disgrace and a national disgrace and an international disgrace. And furthermore, again, what I mentioned was the rippling out of the Sunni-Shia split could be widespread. The fact is, and the depressing fact is, and I have no positive solution, is that the record of civil wars ending with some sort of moderate solution is not a good one historically. Generally, one side or another tends to win. And the side that would win in Iraq is the more populous side, the Shia side, which is not the more popular side in the Arab world. So it's not a hopeful situation, but I do think pulling out, I still think pulling out would hasten the explosion.
EJ?
Well, I think the question is, will staying in keep the explosion from happening? And that at some point, we're going to have to look at this and say, we're not going to leave American troops there forever. This war, as of Sunday, will be longer than World War II was. The voters clearly signaled an impatience with what's going on over there. And so while I think you can't just pull the troops out willy-nilly, I think we need a path to get out of there within the next year or so that causes the least possible damage to our interests and to the Iraqis.
EJ, very quickly to back home, you have the House Democrats, Nancy Pelosi saying she wants a caucus of House Democrats. She's invited Zbigniew Brzezinski from the Carter administration, Richard Holbrooke, the former UN ambassador, to sit around and talk to them. What else can the Democrats do other than just criticize? Are they in a position now to be part of a constructive solution?
Well, some of that's up to the president. I mean, the president under our system has almost the entire power over foreign policy unless Congress is willing to cut off funds for the war, which most of the Democrats have said they don't want to do because they don't want to endanger our troops. But a lot of the people who voted for the Democrats in this year's elections were voting for, to use a Democratic slogan, a new direction in Iraq, and they were voting to get us out of there. So I think it's incumbent upon the Democrats to put together alternatives. I think you have people like Senator Jack Reed in Rhode Island, Senator Carl Levin, who are trying to suggest paths toward withdrawal that would be, would be less destructive to the Iraqis and to us. And I think the Democrats have to do that.
David, what is the most useful role for the Democrats right now in this?
Well, I do think doing what Joe Biden is doing, which is just throwing up ideas. There's no question, as EJ indicated, the direction of Democratic policy is toward withdrawal. The problem will be they've been quoting a lot of military experts, a lot of former generals all through the last 3 years as authorities on Iraq. Most of those authorities do not think we should leave, and so suddenly they'll be going against the authorities they've been quoted. I should mention, I think the president's biggest problem will be the Republicans, not the Democrats. House Republicans, Senate Republicans, those few that remain, that happy band, they want to be out. They do not ever want to face another election, 2008, with American troops substantially in Iraq. And so they are going to be a bigger problem for the White House than the Democrats' problem.
I think that's right, and I think the Democrats don't want to be in a sort of stab-in-the-back position. They don't want the Republicans to take the mess that they started, and if it turns out badly, to blame the Democrats for it. So they have to walk a very careful line.
And we just heard Kwame Holman's report, excellent report on what's happened to the moderates, and among others, we heard Jim Leach say the center has disappeared. I mean, do you agree with that?
Well, I think the Republicans vacated the center, which is why really good people like Jim Leach lost in the last election. I think all the Republicans in that piece were very clear about why they lost. Barney Frank, the congressman from Massachusetts, once said that with the exception of Leach and a couple of others, the moderate Republicans are the people who were always with you when you don't need them. And that the problem was that many of these moderate Republicans, they didn't stick together as a group. Enough of them always voted for the conservative leadership that the conservative leadership could run roughshod over anyone who didn't buy conservative or very right-wing ideas. And I think this is the election in which the American people decided, even if they're decent, smart, moderate, if they're Republicans, they're going to be voting for policies well to the right of where they are. A lot of these folks were elected by Democrats who crossed lines to vote Republican. It's very hard to be a moderate Republican anymore. The irony is Republicans now need moderates more than ever if they're going to rebuild their majority, and they have fewer of them.
David, how do you see the implications of the fewer and fewer moderates in the Republican side?
Well, obviously, the party, first of all, has to get out of an intellectual rut. You know, listening to Kwame's piece, I was reminded of a meeting I had, I think it was about October 8th, 2005, 13 weeks before the election, with about 26 House moderates, most of whom subsequently lost their jobs. And they knew 13 months before the election they were going to lose. They were in a total panic about it, and yet the party did nothing. I recall another meeting with a group of senators who said, we've got to protect our moderates. The party did nothing about it. Why did the party do nothing about it? First, because they couldn't really believe they were going to lose, because they had this victorious mentality. But second, and most importantly, because they were in an intellectual rut, which was all conservative all the time. And so they really had no intellectual energy for the center. And so what the party has to do is create something like a Republican Leadership Council. The Democrats have the DLC, which for moderate Democrats, the Republicans have to create a body of ideas that will appeal to people in New England and the upper Midwest. They have none of that right now, and that's their core problem going ahead.
Well, until that happens, David, what are the implications for policy right now?
Well, I think as Jim Leach put it, there is no center. Some of the Democrats are now centrists, but there is just still the tone of partisanship. Team spirit dominates everything still on Capitol Hill, and after this moment of peace right now, I suspect we'll return to that with a vengeance. The only hope will be the 2008 candidates, who I really think are pretty unorthodox and could be a breath of fresh air.
On that note, EJ, unless you want to say something in 5 seconds.
It depends on whether John McCain and Rudy Giuliani, for example, decide they want to be that breath of fresh air, or do they think they still have to chase the right wing in the party in order to get the nomination? And then they'll lose the opportunity to do what David rightly says the Republicans need to do.
And it looks like Mr. Giuliani and Mr. McCain are about to look at this seriously.
It does seem that way.
Okay.
I still don't think Giuliani's going to run, but that's a personal view, and I'm often wrong on these things.
We'll give you another chance to talk about that.
All right, thank you.
EJ Dionne, thank you very much. David Brooks, thank you both. Finally, we wrap up a week of conversations about what the world can and should do about Darfur. And then we look at a museum exhibit of images from the world's newest genocide. Over the past several days, we've heard proposals for military action, more active diplomacy, and economic sanctions. Now, Ray Suarez talks to a human rights activist who calls for stronger action from the international community.
And that idea comes from Al-Bakir Mukhtar, senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, an organization promoting conflict resolution. Originally from North Sudan and now a British subject, Mukhtar was previously campaign coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa region for Amnesty International. He travels to Sudan regularly. And Al-Bakir Mukhtar, what's your main suggestion for ending the conflict in Darfur?
For the international community to show resolution, to show that they are serious about protecting the civilians in Darfur at the moment, because they are in dire need for protection, and then to show determination that they have to end this conflict and to bring the two parties, NRF, the National Redemption Front, that are fighting in Darfur, and the government to the negotiating table, and to admit that the Darfur peace agreement is now dead in the water, and they have to renegotiate a new settlement, because it's essentially a bad, quickly fixed agreement that was obvious to everybody it's not going to work, and now it proved it's not working.
Now, you say show resolution.
Yeah.
Does that mean that it would bring the international community directly into conflict with the Khartoum government?
Khartoum government has always been in conflict with the international community. There is nothing new about that. They've been in conflict with its own people, and it's been in conflict with all of its neighbors, and it's been in conflict with the international community, because it's simply a regime, a rogue regime.
Now, officially, the government denies links to the Janjaweed, denies links to any armed force that's been targeting civilians in Darfur. But up until now, every time they've put on the brakes, every time they've put up a stop sign, every time they've said, we don't want this to continue, the world has backed off. What are you saying should happen now?
The international community has been sending wrong messages to Khartoum. The resolution itself, the 1706 UN Security Council resolution, is weak. It included a clause saying that UN peacekeeping forces should be deployed in Darfur with the consent of the government of Sudan. And the government of Sudan refused to give its consent. So, and I think now the right message that the international community should send to Khartoum is that we are going to deploy these forces, whether with or without your consent. This is one thing. Khartoum should know that there will be consequences if it continues to hold the whole international community hostage to its whims. There should be concrete measures that will be sent to Khartoum. If you are not going to abide by this, if you are not going to allow us to protect the people in Darfur and to deploy these UN peacekeeping forces, then we are going to enforce a no-fly zone, for instance. We are going to target to have a blockade on your trade with the world. We are going to hit you where it hurts. This is the only message that would make Khartoum rethink its position.
Will the international community have the will, have the desire, have the organization to start being tougher on the government in Khartoum? So far, it hasn't been able to.
The United States administration has to bring Russia and China on board. This is the first step. Then the rest will be obvious, because they cannot blockade or veto or delay or water down any resolution that is going to come from the Security Council.
Does the government, the Sudanese government, a recognized government around the world, have some reason, because of Sudan's history, because of Sudan's recent past, to insist on its sovereignty, to insist on control over its borders, and to say, well, we've got rebels fighting against our government here. We have to have control of this situation.
And this is exactly what Khartoum is saying, and this is not true. I mean, first of all, the security concerns, the real security concerns, as the security concerns of the people of Darfur, who's been paying by their lives on daily basis, in killing, in rape, in displacement, and deprivation of many of their rights. So this is going on. It is going on as we speak. This should be stopped. And the international community should be concerned with this first. Khartoum is not concerned with it, because Khartoum is the culprit who is doing it. So they're not concerned about this, actually. If a state is failed to protect its own people, more than that, if a state is targeting and killing its own people, it disqualifies itself. It abdicates its own sovereignty by its own action. And the international community should take the responsibility to protect these people.
Do you believe that if the world was ready to be tougher on the Sudanese government, that government would back down?
I'm absolutely positive in that. I'm absolutely positive, because the history of this government, since it came to power, it did not respond to anything but real threat and real resolution. Whenever there is a loophole or there is a weakness in the international position, this government is going to exploit it to the end. And it exploited now the weaknesses in the resolution 1706, exploited it to the end, because there is no consequences that Khartoum could fear would happen to it if it rejected the resolution, and it rejected it, and it challenged the whole world, the international will, and it is holding now the international community hostage, because they can't do anything, because there is no strategic approach to doing it, because they talk and they do not do anything. There is no real threat. This is why the message which is received in Khartoum is that, well, we can challenge the international community, we can even challenge the American administration, and we are safe. Nothing is going to happen to us.
Al-Bakir Mukhtar, thank you.
Thank you.
And now Darfur in pictures and words in Washington. And again to Ray Suarez.
This week in Washington, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is sending the public a message about Darfur, even the public that doesn't visit the museum. by projecting pictures of civilian suffering in Sudan onto its building's exterior. I spoke with museum director Sarah Bloomfield. Well, here we are in this museum so closely identified in the public's mind with the mass murder of Jews and others during World War II. Why are you taking up the cause of Darfur?
We were conceived not just as a museum, but as something very unique, a living memorial. This was Elie Wiesel's idea for this museum, that we would teach not just the history of the Holocaust, but the lessons of the Holocaust. Those are lessons about the fragility of freedom, about the importance of the dignity of the individual, and about the ongoing need to address issues of hate, of anti-Semitism, of genocide. So this was part of our conception from the beginning. And we feel that the most powerful way to pay tribute to the 6 million Jews and the millions of others murdered by the Nazis is to try to prevent future genocides and to do so in their name. That is the power of the memorial.
So it's consistent with what you call the mission of the museum. But what about the decision to turn the museum, in effect, into a billboard, making an exhibit on the outside of your building?
This is an extreme situation. And one of the things we keep asking ourselves is what could have been different in 1941 and 42? I mean, the U.S. government knew about the plans to murder the Jews of Europe and yet did nothing. We are trying to look at history, take lessons from history, and make it different this time. So in this extreme situation, we wanted to make an extreme statement. And that was by projecting these very powerful images of this horrible tragedy out for the public, where people can't look away, but have to confront it. And to do so against the backdrop of, if you will, the moral stature and authority of this institution.
Some of the most heartrending photographs I've ever seen have come out of the reporting of Darfur. When you had to make some decisions about what to put on the outside of this building, how did you make those decisions of what to show the public about what's going on in Africa?
We looked at those photographs. Now, something we are very sensitive at the museum is we want to make sure that we are educating people and compelling them to action, but also being respectful of the victims whose lives, and in this case, terrible, tragic deaths we are portraying. One of our other concerns is also to remind people that this happened to individuals.
That suffering isn't going on in secret, though. I mean, if you've watched the evening news over the past couple of years, if you've picked up a newspaper, and now with celebrities involved, even if you've read People magazine, you know what's going on in Darfur. Why do you think Americans have yet to become inflamed over this issue?
The question is not just the publicity, the attention, the shocking images. I worry that people are too used to some of these images. So what we're trying to do at the museum is a combination, if you will, of education, of a word that I think is sort of overused, but empowerment, teaching people that individuals can make a difference, and of course this sense of this stimulus to act with these images, which we hope are powerful and compelling.
The projection of these images on the outside of the building will soon come to an end, but has the museum made a policy decision to stay involved in Darfur?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's core to our mission. If we are concerned about preventing and addressing current and future genocides, which we are, we will stay on this issue as long as we have to.
The Darfur images will continue to be shown on the walls of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington through midnight this Sunday. Again, the major developments of this day: reprisal killings against Sunni Muslims swept across Baghdad, leaving at least 25 dead. The death toll from yesterday's attacks rose to 215. And a former KGB spy blamed Russian President Putin for his poisoning before the man died. Putin has denied any involvement. Washington Week can be seen later this evening on most PBS stations. We'll see you online and again here Monday evening. Have a nice weekend. I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you and good night.